This is a BBC podcast. You can get all our podcasts and our terms of use at bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Hello, I'm Will Grant, and welcome to this week's edition of Assignment. There are times in Cuba when you could be forgiven for wondering if anything has changed since the revolutionaries rolled into Havana in January 1959. It's been kept in a time warp by a trade embargo imposed by the United States for more than 50 years, which is why there are so many classic cars here. Nearly a third of all those on the road, like props in a 1950s film set.
These things that we can see on the streets at the moment, they're called almendrones. That basically means a big almond. So an almendra is an almond, and an almendron is a big almond. So they're basically the big 1950s gas guzzlers, like this blue one coming in front of us at the moment. It's a catch-all term that you only find in Cuba, meaning big, outdated 1950s Chevy or Cadillac.
While motorists the world over are urged to buy the latest model, Cubans have had to make do with the old one. But now, with the thaw between Washington and Havana gathering pace, there's talk of the embargo being lifted. In this week's assignment, we ask if this could be the start of a new revolution, one which could change Cubans' lives forever. This bright blue almendron is a DeSoto, manufactured in America by Chrysler in 1948. It belongs to Ignacio, a father of two in Havana who uses it for family outings, taking the kids to the beach and helping his mum out.
Nice.
Look under the bonnet,
Pop the hood.
and you begin to understand the resourcefulness and ingenuity which helps to keep these cars on the road.
Wow. Now, even to my untrained eye, this looks original.
Aquí todo lo que tiene es original. Tiene algunos inventicos, pero bueno, como todo.
So he's saying it's all original. It has a few inventicos, little inventions, but everything else is original. What are those inventicos?
Algunas piezas,
Sí, pero ¿cuáles? Tú sabes.
como los frenos,
The brakes,
¿entiendes? Reparar bien la dirección,
the steering,
la instalación eléctrica.
the electrics.
Ajá.
Unos cuantos inventicos.
Claro.
A few. There's a fair
No es
few.
lo mismo los frenos modernos cuando vienen con discos y pinzas que con los frenos que venían en el año 48.
That is true. He's saying it's not quite the same having brakes that date to the 1940s as opposed to having modern brakes. And with this rain that's hitting the island so much recently, I imagine you need decent brakes. If the embargo was to be lifted, do you think that you would want to find something a little more modern?
Bueno, es lógico. La tecnología avanza. Y todo
So he's saying elsewhere countries change with the technological change. Cuba hasn't been able to change because of the blockade, as they call it in Spanish, as opposed to the embargo. They call it the blockade. So the blockade has meant that they can't evolve with the times. And obviously, if you could get something that was a bit more comfortable, didn't damage the streets so much like anywhere else, you would. But the thing is, as he said, if all you've got to eat is bread, then you eat bread. So, that's the case with this. If this is what they've got, they have to make do. Suena como una pregunta obvia, pero ¿usted quiere ver el fin del embargo, del bloqueo? Do you want to see the end of the embargo, or are you concerned that it might change some of that creative spirit of the Cubans if they suddenly get everything they need?
Es lógico. Si le estoy hablando debido al bloqueo.
He does want to see it removed like all Cubans do. There's no nostalgia on his part for the idea of the embargo, or that it's brought anything useful. It's been 50 years, as he says. He's 47, so he's born under the embargo. He's known nothing but the revolution, and it's tiring. He's tired of it. He says there's been people killed for it or kill themselves, trying to leave the island. It's a real drag to constantly live your life in this kind of, he called it asphyxiante, like asphyxiating.
Se llama Edsel, que es de la Ford, pero ya terminó.
Nash?
Está después Nash.
We chat with Ignacio and his friends, chewing the fat before heading off.
Nash Rambler. Está el Hudson, que es inglés.
They might be a nightmare to maintain, but they know their cars here, naming the many American makes which can still be found on the island. Cuba's classic cars are immensely popular with the tourists, allowing some owners to make money hiring them out. Nostalgicar, run by Nidialis Acosta and her husband Julio, is one of an increasing number of private businesses which have emerged since Fidel Castro's brother Raúl took over the presidency 7 years ago.
This car, all the time you need to do something. For example, the blue car we finished 3 years ago to restore, and now we have to paint again to restore the engine, to fix some body work of the car. Mm-hmm. We don't finish nunca.
Ever.
But that is the passion to my husband. So win money with this passion.
Yep.
And it's good for me, or for him, for my son. We are happy with that.
It sounds to me a little bit like he brings the passion for restoring cars, and you bring the business sense for turning it into a profitable business. So
yes.
Maybe he's the heart and you're the head, you're the brain when
yes.
it comes to the company.
Yes, yes.
Do you find that you're often very, very frustrated with trying to do this kind of work in Cuba?
It's very difficult sometimes, but here in Cuba we are acostumbrados.
You're used to?
Yeah, it's like a river. Si tenemos un obstáculo aquí, lo vamos bordeando.
So it's like a river. If you have an obstacle in your way, you go around it.
Yes.
You find a way around it.
Yes, hasta llegar al lugar donde queremos llegar.
Until you get to your destination. What difference will it make if the embargo is lifted in the next 3 or 5 years?
For my business, if Obama finished the embargo, will be the best. Because more tourists, more American tourists for rent our car, more facility to bring the part and to maintain and restore more car.
Since the rules on private enterprise in Cuba began to be relaxed in 2008, you're starting to see many more of these little businesses here, mainly in the service industry, as people like Nidialis and Julio open small restaurants and cafes, bed and breakfasts, or become taxi drivers and mechanics.
I think it's fair to say they're part of a sort of emerging middle class in Cuba. Obviously, this is a place that's sort of prided itself on not having classes because, everybody's supposed to be the same, but we know that's not true. We know that's not the case. And the thing that their clear passion for restoring cars and her very obvious business acumen has brought them is, I think, a comfortable lifestyle. I don't think they're wealthy, and I think they're going to have to keep working at it day in, day out for months and years to come. But I don't think that bothers them, and I think that they will be the people who, in 10 years' time, are actually looked upon as the sort of canny ones, the people who grabbed an opportunity when they saw it.
There's another type of car on the roads which speaks to Cuba's past.
Felix, they tell me you are the owner of a Soviet-era vehicle. Do you want to show it to us?
We're looking at a Moskvich, a Russian car dating back to when the Soviet Union was helping to prop up the Cuban economy. Not everybody could buy one. They were only available to a chosen few.
It's from 1985. There we are. Pretty basic looking functional Soviet engineering, as you can imagine. Just a whole hodgepodge, though, of
Original todo.
Original todo.
Original todo.
It's all
Todo,
original, he
todo
says.
original, todo.
All original. So these are all the original parts from the Soviet Union. Felix, tell me what happens if any of these parts break.
Oh, un dolor de cabeza. Pero resuelve.
So he's saying, yeah, it's a massive headache, but se resuelve. It gets fixed. It gets resolved. He says, as the famous song goes, which I think is a kind of Cuban salsa song, things get fixed. It's a great... A quick kiss to the car, which, as he points out, is now 30 years old and has, by and large, all its original parts. How did you first get this car?
Eso, yo cortaba caña.
Cortando. He was a sugarcane cutter.
Entonces, cortaba caña, entonces, por el estímulo que tú tenías, un estímulo grande.
As a stimulus for the workers.
Gracias al comandante jefe.
You could get first a motorbike, and then, if you really worked, you could get a car. It was to stimulate, to incentivize the workers into harder work. So he got it, as he said just at the end there, gracias to el comandante en jefe, thanks to the commander-in-chief, Fidel Castro.
Cars like Felix's are probably the clearest indicator of the Soviet legacy in Cuba. There are buildings and other reference points, but streets teeming with larders and Moskviches show that the Soviets were once here. We say goodbye to Felix, but our presence in the neighbourhood has aroused suspicions. 2 police officers draw up in their car and demand to see my papers. Cuba is still far from being an open society. The foreign press is tolerated, but not always welcomed.
So, just as we were leaving from having seen Felix's aged car, the police arrived, apparently tipped off by a neighbour that some strange men with microphones and with a small camera were taking photographs and talking to people. And, the police took my documents, asked me what I was doing. It wasn't particularly intimidating, but it's a really good indication of just how paranoid the place still is.
De Cuba traigo un cantar hecho de palma y de sol, cantar de la vida nueva y del trabajo creado.
We stopped to see 2 men working on a car. It needs a new carburettor, which would cost more than a year's wages in Cuba, so they're attempting to fix it. They're joined by a friend, Raúl Sánchez Parodi, whose father, funnily enough, was Cuba's top diplomat in the United States at the height of the Cold War, heading up the Cuban Interests section in Washington, D.C., a means of keeping diplomatic communications open without a full embassy. Raúl is one of the lucky ones. His father, along with other government officials, enjoyed certain privileges, including the opportunity to buy a car, which he later passed on to his son.
Now it's a very old car, it's all 30 years. But I have learned a lot of mechanics, and now it gets easy for me to do it.
And so you've learned through necessity rather than...
Yeah, I think all the Cubans have learned from the necessities. Yes, of course.
Yeah. And do you work solely as a mechanic, or do you have another job?
Well, I used to work on a travel agency, and now I'm working as a mechanic.
So this programme we're making is about the embargo and the future of the embargo and the idea that one day it might disappear. Do you think it will disappear? Can you imagine that day coming?
Well, it will take a lot of years to come.
Although there's been talk of change, for many Cubans...
They don't see any change.
Do you think they will only see change if the embargo is lifted? Is that the main thing?
Well, I think so. I think if the embargo ends, it will be good for Cuba. I don't know how good, but it has to be good, because if we are living like this, and one of the problems is the embargo, if you end it, something must change.
Do you worry that Cuba will lose something?
Yeah, it will. Cuba will lose. Yeah, of course. The enchantment that Cuba has. But, well, man, that's the price we have to pay,
Is that just romanticism, or is it real?
Well, it's real, because Cuba is not a common country, You see things here in Cuba that you cannot see in any other country. And that's the enchantment of Cuba, you know, and their people. I want changes for good. Well, but I don't want Cuba to become another country in the Caribbean.
Hey, sounds like you got it working. We're off to see a man about a car. We've found somebody who's selling a classic car. We think it is a red convertible that dates to before the revolution. We want to check out what condition it's in and what sort of price he's asking for it. Here it comes. Good Lord. Buenas. Sell me this car. Véndeme el carro. ¿Cómo es? Véndemelo.
La dueña quiere $20,000 por allá. Porque quiere, como el esposo falleció, no le interesa tener el carro, no puede mantenerlo.
He hasn't really gone for the hard sell. He's just said that the owner wants $20,000 for it, $20,000. Her husband died. She can't maintain it. She can't keep it, so she's looking to sell it. The car isn't quite what it seems. On the outside, we're looking at an Italian open-top convertible made more than 50 years ago. But the engine has been replaced with that of a Russian-made Lada. It's only the shell of what it once was, but we asked to take it for a spin all the same. Okay. Well, it is a very, very cool looking car. As far as I can see, absolutely none of the dials work whatsoever. So we're picking up speed. The speedometer is staying firmly fixed. Part of me knows that this is probably the most impractical vehicle I could get my hands on. A pre-revolutionary Italian red convertible with a Soviet-era engine. And yet part of me just wants to part with the $20,000 being asked. Gracias. I'll think about it. Even supposing you can find a car for sale, such prices aren't unusual and way beyond what most people can afford. So that means taking the bus. And of course, it started to rain. Tropical downpours like this tend to be short and intense. Very intense, so we might be getting a little wet while we're waiting for this bus. Buses in Cuba are known as wawas, for reasons I haven't been able to fathom. So, as the rain is at its height, the bus has arrived. The fares are cheap, but then the average Cuban wage, around $20 to $30 a month, isn't much either. It's the end of the day, and the people on this bus are factory workers, service workers, people in the state sector.
Malísimo. Esto no está mirando porque no tiene frecuencia las guaguas aquí.
She's saying she lives in Alamar, which is outside Havana, and she has to come all this way into the city, into this particular part of the city to work. She can't afford the fact that the buses are moving into private hands where they cost more, so she has to use this, and the service is very, very irregular. Transport is a necessity that we don't have, she says.
Bueno.
This man in his 50s is somewhat less critical of the government for the problems and instead blames Washington for imposing decades of economic sanctions on Cuba.
¿En qué sentido? En todos los sentidos. Si nosotros no tuviéramos bloqueo este país.
So he's saying basically it's affected Cuba in every way because they can't buy, they can't sell. Everything's been made so difficult for them. This country could be a developed country were it not for the embargo. That's his argument. Many people choose another way. Cuba is a country where hitchhiking is still accepted, and groups of people like Janet, an accountant working for the private sector, can be seen at road intersections.
La botella tiene su parte buena. Yo he tenido, es decir, mi novio lo conocí en la botella y tengo buenas amistades.
She's basically made the argument in defence of hitching. She says that in the botella, in the bottle that it's known as for basically hitching, she met her boyfriend that way. You find that sometimes it's people you know, it might be the friend of a cousin or something like that. You talk, you meet people, you might find out about a job that's going, you might meet somebody who's looking for somebody to work on something, and she said it contributes to the socialization of Cuba. That said, she has obviously just entered the note of caution, the obvious note of caution. She says that there isn't much violence or crime in Cuba, but as a woman on your own, you need to be careful. You've got to be very alert. You shouldn't be taking them at night on your own. If you were to get in a car, particularly if it's got tinted windows, particularly if it's got a lot of guys in there and you're the only girl on your own, so you do need to be careful. Ciao, Janet. Bye. Getting around outside the cities is another matter, but if anything, outside Havana the effects of the embargo can be felt even more keenly. So the state of these country roads is really not good. Those that do have tarmac are very, very potholed, but the vast majority are just dirt roads, and it's incredible really that we're just such a short distance outside Havana. It's only 20 or 30 kilometres, 15 or 20 miles, and yet it's incomparable really. It's another world. Careful of the dog, beware of the dog, that's not a good sign. Okay, here we are. Farmer Juan Silva grows fruit and vegetables here. Papaya, mangoes, guava, tomatoes and lettuces. Much of it goes to the state, but since Raul Castro's reforms he's allowed to sell some of it himself, although he doesn't make much. Juan's parents and grandparents worked this land before him, but he wants something better for his children. Right in the middle of the farmyard is his sturdy old Russian tractor, which it turns out is missing a vital part. No tiene. That's incredible. It doesn't have a starter motor, so he can only bump start his tractor. That was quite an impressive trick.
Entonces hay que repararle el motor y todo, y para conseguir las piezas muy caras y súper trabajoso. Muy viejo.
Yeah, very old, he's saying. It's very, very old. Of course, it's a nightmare to find the pieces. They no longer produce them. You have to really hunt around. If you're lucky enough to find one, they're very expensive. It's a lot of effort to find the right pieces.
Si pudiera uno nuevo, mejor. Ya es muy trabajoso. Las piezas de subir para el arado, todo es muy ya... tiene más de 40 años. ¿Entiendes? Uno nuevo es mejor, por supuesto. Ojalá lo vendiera.
It's over 40 years old, and of course he'd like something better, but there just isn't anything out there. And the American ones are far nicer, he'd like proper technology, so I mean, this would be really a beneficiary of lifting the trade embargo, because these are exactly the sorts of things that producers of this sort of machinery are trying to get into the country. They're desperate to start selling their products in Cuba because they know there's a willing and open market of 11 million people, a decent proportion of whom live in the countryside and need new farm equipment to replace outdated Soviet tractors like this one. So far for Cuban farmers, there is little sign that the opening of the US Embassy or the visit by the US Secretary of State will make much difference to their lives. But they're both parts of a wider process of normalisation. I asked Juan about the prospect of the embargo eventually being lifted.
Sí, yo creo que debe pasar. Es muchos años ya de...
Yes, he wants to see it going, even though he's aware that he might be some of the most vulnerable. He just said, of course, you know, you look at the size of the land we've got, and he said, gesturing to the land just in front of us. But it might be that multinational companies come in and start taking over swathes of land and forcing small-scale producers like him off the radar. But he's prepared to take that risk for his children, who would obviously have a better life if this embargo wasn't in place. Y el embargo, si lo levantan, ¿cuáles serían los productos que primero que nada tú buscarías para mejorar la vida? If the embargo was lifted, what items would you try and get hold of first? I imagine get a new tractor.
No sé, de así decirte, no sé, eso no...
So he's saying really that he can't say, and when he puts his mind to start thinking about it, it's quite a long list. He actually likes this tractor, it's very powerful, it's a very decent piece of machinery, but the problem is there just aren't parts for it. But beyond trying to get rid of the
tractor and replace that for a new one, which wasn't cheap, the things that occurred to him were fertilizers, industrial crop sprayers, seeds, just the items that a farmer needs to get by that aren't really available here or are available in very small quantities. Back at Nostalgica, they're hungry for change. Nidia Alice Acosta and her husband are well aware that they are uniquely poised to make the most of this thaw and any eventual lifting of the economic restrictions it might bring, even if not everyone was convinced when they chose to leave their safe state jobs and take the plunge into the emerging private sector.
At the beginning, when I said to my family, I will be a private worker, my mother told me, you are crazy.
Does she still think you're mad, or can she now see that what you've done has actually been quite good?
Yeah, now she changed.
She understands.
Yes, because we have grown a lot in only 3 years.
Do you think that's true of a lot of Cubans who are of a certain age? They just can't imagine not working for the state.
No tienen la capacidad
they don't understand, and also they lack the kind of entrepreneurial spirit in their blood, because in order to do this you need it in your blood. You need to have a passion for what you're doing, otherwise you won't be a success. And you have a passion, you have this in your blood.
Yes.
While everything else might be scarce, passion is one thing there is certainly no lack of in Cuba. Lifting the embargo and changing the island's future will take more than just passion, though. It's going to need a change in mindset, and no doubt plenty of that Cuban ingenuity on both sides of the Florida Straits. This week's assignment was presented by me, Will Grant, and the producer was Mark Savage.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.